So my name's Ruth. I'm one of the housing advisors here at the University of London. And we're just going to be talking about what your landlord needs to do before you move in. Hopefully you would have read the summary for the webinar, but we'll go through a number of things. So if I can get my slide moving. Yes, okay, perfect. So there are a number of things that your landlord will need to provide you before you move in. And as you can see on the slide here, these are the things. So before moving in, we'll cover, these are the couple of things that we're going to cover. So right to rent checks, referencing. Some of these are legal requirements. And as you can see, their referencing is optional, but quite popular as we'll discuss in a minute. How to rent guide is a legal requirement, then EPC certificates, gas safety certificates, and the electrical installation condition report, and then deposit protection, depending on when your deposit is taken. So we'll cover each of these in turn. So before you move in, your landlord will need to provide you with a right to rent. Sorry, your landlord will need to carry out right to rent checks on you. And this is a legal duty on the landlord. So they need to check that you have the right to live in the UK, your immigration status. And so if you've rented before, you know that either the landlord or agent will often ask you for a copy of your ID, so your passport, a copy of your visa, or any other relevant immigration documents. And they'll take those and make copies of them to keep on record, to ensure that they have checked your right to rent status. If they don't do that, then they're breaking the law. So this is something that you should expect that they will do right at the beginning of you being interested and going ahead before you go ahead with the tenancy. You shouldn't expect to be charged for these checks. That's something that the landlord has to do without charging you. So if you are asked to pay any fees towards any of these checks being done, then you know that that's not acceptable, and you shouldn't pay those any fees for this. So the next thing that your landlord may or may not do is referencing. So a lot of you will be asked to provide referees. As I mentioned, referencing is not a legal requirement, but most landlords will want to check that you are a reliable tenant, and that you will essentially be able to pay your rent, and that you will meet the obligations under the contract, such as keeping the property in a good condition. So, and they'll do this by carrying out reference checks. So referencing checks can come in different forms, and some of the ways that the checks might be carried out include asking for references from previous landlords. This is the most common one. And a lot of students have and will be asked to provide a reference from a previous landlord. This can be you could ask, for example, if you've lived in halls previously, you might ask for a reference from your university hall, or of course, if you've lived in private accommodation, you can also ask a previous landlord to provide you with a reference. They may also carry out credit checks. That's also a very popular one, and you can expect that they probably will carry out a credit check. And then they might also do identification checks. So as I mentioned, right to rent checks. They might also ask for character references. So those you might be able to get from, for example, a family friend, or a university tutor, or somebody like that, someone who knows you and can vouch for your character. Again, you're not supposed to be charged for these referencing checks. So if there are any requests to pay for referencing checks, then that's something that you should say no to. And you should know that they're breaking the law if they're asking for you to pay for referencing checks. We do have questions often about what if you've had a not so good relationship with your previous landlord? What should you do in that case if you're worried that they might give you a negative reference? That's not necessarily easy to get around, because you can't force somebody to give you a good reference. They don't have to give you a positive reference. And if there have been issues, then they most likely the reference won't be positive. So you can't force them to give you a good reference, and the way around that might be to approach somebody else for a reference. So maybe if you've lived in, if you've had 2 previous landlords, for example, you might approach another landlord that you might have had a better experience with. And if you haven't, in some cases, there might be, if the relationship with your landlord has been rocky, but not been your fault, something has happened, for example, disrepair or anything like that, which has made your relationship difficult, then you might just want to be honest with your prospective landlord or agent, and just tell them what the situation was, and tell them that you might have a negative reference from that particular landlord, and just be honest and tell them the circumstances, because some landlords might be understanding about that. And given that you can't change what the other landlord might say, that might be another way to try and find accommodation or go through with your suitable accommodation. And some landlords might be open to that. And then they might also then carry out credit checks and ask you to provide a character reference, for example. So that's a way that you can try and get around if you're unable to get, or if you think you're going to have a negative reference from a previous landlord. So the other legal requirement for your landlord to provide you before you move in is a how to rent guide. Your landlord must provide you with the most recent copy of the government produced how to rent guide before you move in. This is a guide really that gives you information about your rights and responsibilities when you're letting private accommodation. So it will give you information regarding evictions, gives you information regarding landlord's repair obligations, your own responsibilities under a tenancy, and things like that. The latest guides are always online, but your landlord has to give you a copy of this themselves. And this is one of the things that they need to ensure that they check off before you move in. In relation to how to rent guides, if you're curious and just want to have a look at one, you can actually go onto the gov.uk website and have a look. That you will be able to find the latest guide on there, but your landlord has a legal obligation to give you one. So with regards to the safety in the home, there are a number of things that your landlord has to provide you before you move in. An energy performance certificate is the first one. So sometimes you might find that this is advertised. When the property is advertised, they might put an energy performance certificate in the pictures alongside the advert. And that energy performance certificate really just tells you the energy efficiency of a property. It's rated on a scale of A to G. Rented properties have to have a rating of at least an E. So your landlord has to be able to prove that their property is meeting the EPC requirements. And they should provide this to you before you move into the property. You are actually able to search it online using the property's postcode. So if you, for example, go on Google for the particular property you're interested in, if you type in energy performance certificate search, and you should be able to find the certificate for that particular property just using the postcode. So that's something that you can do yourself, but the landlord again has an obligation to provide you with this before you move in. The next thing that you should be provided with is a gas safety certificate. It has an obligation to ensure that all gas appliances are checked, and they have to be checked by a registered engineer, and they will issue a gas safety certificate. So once that certificate is issued, your landlord has to provide you with that before or at the point of you moving into the property. So when you're a new incoming tenant, you must have it before or at the point that you move in. And that will tell you that the gas appliances in the property have been checked and that they're safe. And again, this is a legal requirement. So if your landlord doesn't provide it, there's a number of implications, which range from them not being able to serve you with a Section 21 eviction notice, for example, and other things that I won't go into detail about now. The other certificate that the landlord will be required to provide you is the electrical installation condition report. So this is things such as wiring, sockets, fuse boxes. Your landlord has an obligation to check these and ensure that they're also safe and they're in working order. And they have to use somebody who's a qualified professional to do those checks, and then provide you with the EICR, which is the report that that professional would provide them at the end of the check. And again, they have to do this before your tenancy starts. So essentially, on moving in, you should expect, in relation to safety in the home, to have an EPC gas safety certificate and an electrical installation condition report. In relation to the gas safety certificate, that would only be relevant where the property has gas. So if the property doesn't have gas and it uses electricity for everything, then the landlord isn't expected to carry out that check, obviously, because it won't be relevant. So the other thing I mentioned that might be, the landlord might have to provide you information in relation to before you move in, is your deposit protection. So if you pay your deposit before moving in, so for example, if your tenancy starts in September and you agree and make the payments, the deposit payment in July, for example, sign the contract, but the contract actually starts in September. If you've paid in July, the landlord is required to protect your deposit within 30 days of receiving your money. So at that point, after those 30 days, they have to provide you with the relevant prescribed information regarding your deposit. Prescribed information is just information in relation to where your deposit is protected, how much you've paid, the property address, and things like that. So they will have to give you that information before your tenancy starts if you've paid your deposit 30 days beforehand. Your contract will normally include information about your deposit and where it will be protected, but this is separate to the prescribed information that your landlord would have to give you. So just be aware of that. Sometimes the prescribed information is included in your contract, so look out for that as well. If it's in the contract, then that's fine. If it's not in the contract, then it does have to be provided separately. The prescribed information will also sometimes, depending on where your deposit is protected, will include a protection certificate as well. And it might have a code that you can enter into the tenancy deposit scheme, and it will bring up your information about your deposit being protected. So that's something to look out for as well. So that's all the information and documents that need to be provided to you before you move in. And then after you've moved in, there are also ongoing obligations on the landlord to carry out certain checks, make sure that the property is in repair, and then the deposit protection information might be required as well. If you've paid just before you move in, they will then also have to give you deposit protection information, namely the prescribed information. So I'll go through these in turn, the 3 points that you can see there on the screen. So the gas and electrical safety checks, we mentioned before about what the requirements before you move in. So these are the requirements after you move in. Your landlord is required to arrange for all gas appliances to be checked every 12 months. So if you're going to be living in the property longer than 12 months, the initial certificate that you would have been given at the beginning of your contract won't be valid after 12 months. So the landlord will have to carry out the checks again. And once they've done that, if you're already living in the property, they then need to give you a copy of the gas safety certificate within 28 days of that check being carried out. Again, if they don't do that, then they're breaking the law, and there are implications for that. Your landlord has to ensure also that all electrical installations are checked. Again, this is the EICR, the certificate that they would have to provide you. So if you've been living, and this isn't necessarily likely for you as students, but just for your information anyway, if you're in the property longer than 5 years, for example, then the landlord would have to carry out those electrical installation checks again after 5 years. And again, they're required to provide you with a copy of that report so that you're aware about the safety of those installations. And then the final point here is that the landlord is responsible for ensuring that repairs are carried out during your tenancy. So they are responsible for a number of things by law. So the heating, hot water supply, basin sinks, baths, the general structure of the property. So that would include things like windows, external doors, drains, gutters, boilers, fixed electrical installations. So we've spoken about wiring, fittings, electrical sockets, that kind of thing. The landlord would generally be responsible for making sure that these things are kept in repair. So if there's any issue around any of these things not working or creating any sort of safety hazard, then your responsibility is to notify the landlord as soon as possible so that they can resolve it. The landlord has a responsibility to ensure that these are repaired within a reasonable amount of time. And as soon as you notify them, that time will start running. So as a tenant, your responsibility is to ensure that you've told the landlord. Where they haven't responded or they're taking a while to deal with the issue, make sure that you follow up in writing and tell them if the problem is getting worse, for example, make sure that you communicate that so that the landlord is aware and you have evidence to show that you have told the landlord and that you followed up on it in case the problem escalates or you need to take it a step further if the landlord is not dealing with it. So the landlord should be carrying out these repairs in relation to those things. But it's just your responsibility to ensure that they are aware of those things. There are certain things that a tenant is responsible for just by the nature of, but the requirement that you act like a tenant. It's called things that you're required to do just generally to behave in a tenant-like manner. So for example, things such as replacing light bulbs, putting batteries into smoke alarms where batteries may have run out. Those are the responsibilities of a tenant, and as a tenant, you should be doing those things and not waiting for the landlord to fix them. However, the big things will generally fall to the landlord to carry out those repairs. So that was a very, very quick run through of all the things that your landlord would be required to do. We were supposed to cover the things that your landlord should be doing before your tenancy, but as you can see, there's a couple of things also that will be ongoing requirements for the landlord to do after you've moved in. So I'll now take any questions. I think I've got some already, so let me have a look at those. But if you think of anything, just drop a question into the Q&A area as I go through these questions that I've already had. So we've got a question asking, what if you've never rented in the UK, so you wouldn't have a previous landlord for reference checks? I think depending on the agent or landlord, they might be willing to accept, they might be willing to accept international landlords. But if you're saying, for example, if you've lived at home, even if you've been abroad and you've never rented anywhere, and you've lived with your parents, for example, how can you get around that? I guess you can't get around that, because if you can't provide a landlord, then you simply can't provide a landlord. But you can be honest about it. First of all, let them know that you haven't rented elsewhere, so you're not able to provide a previous landlord, and in that case ask whether they'd be willing to take a reference from a family friend, for example, or really a university tutor, for example, or a previous employer maybe, but they will want to carry out some sort of credit check in that instance. And I think it's just asking what else they're willing to take. Different landlords and different agents will have different policies on what they're willing to accept. So I think you'd have to communicate that with them and see what else they might be willing to accept. But I think in that case, suggesting character references might be the best option for you. The next question is, Just a second. So the next question asks, can you please review what the prescribed information is with regards to your deposit? So when you pay when your deposit is protected, it's a legal requirement that your landlord or agent provides you with this prescribed information in relation to your deposit protection. So I'll go back a bit and tell you what deposit protection is, just in case some of you may not be aware. So when you pay a deposit, there are 3 schemes that are recognized by the government as deposit protection schemes. They were on the screen. I'll try and go back. So these are the 3 deposit protection schemes. So the TDS, DPS, and My Deposits. And they are kind of third-party schemes that the landlord can either put your money into, your deposit into, or they can insure your deposit with them. And the idea is that your deposit is separate from the landlord, and you, at the end of your tenancy, these deposit schemes also run arbitration services, adjudication services, sorry, where they can, if there's any disputes around your deposit between you and the landlord, then they would act as a third-party adjudicator in relation to your deposit. So when your deposit is protected, the landlord has to give you information in relation to where they've protected your deposit. So is it the TDS, DPS, or My Deposits? And that prescribed information will include details on how much you've paid, the property you paid against, and the circumstances in which you might lose your deposit. So when is the landlord allowed to make deductions off your deposit? Normally this will be in relation to rent arrears or any damage that's been caused to the property. It will also tell you when and how you can, after your tenancy, you can get your deposit back, and then also give you details around if there is a dispute in relation to the deposit, how do you go about raising a dispute with the tenancy deposit scheme. So that's the prescribed information. As I said, it would sometimes be included in your contract directly towards the end of the contract, or it will be given to you separately. So have a look through your contract, and if it's not in the contract, then you should be provided with it in a separate document. So that's that. So there is a question more about water pipe issues, a water issue in general. I'm sorry, could you elaborate on that question, please, Louise? Just not sure what you mean there. So the next question is, are the houses still available for graduates, or is the housing service open to non-UOL students? So the housing services is not open to non-UOL students, unfortunately, but there are houses still available. I think you're still in time to find accommodation in London. It's definitely not too late. So do have a look, take your time, don't feel pressurized into thinking that you're running out of time, because there will definitely be something out there for you. So the answer to that is definitely yes, but unfortunately we're not open to non-UOL students. And the next question, what's included in the credit check? How would that work for those who don't have UK bank accounts? What's included in the credit check? Yes, so normally they'd be checking your credit history, and I think this is done with actual credit checking companies. So you would give them your. Sorry about that, I got cut off for a second there. So in relation to the not having UK bank account, sorry, I got cut off as I was giving you the answer to that. I think the best thing to do there would be to ask the agent or landlord that you're interested in letting with how they would deal with that, because I think that they will have different policies on how they approach that. The next question is, what's the best or safest way to make a deposit payment? So making a deposit payment, you definitely want to make it through a bank transfer. Make sure that you're getting receipts for it, make sure that you have in writing how much you're paying, and that everything is documented, but make sure that you're doing it through a bank transfer. and you verified the landlord has given you the details, and you're sure they've communicated the right details. You definitely don't want to do it through money transfer services, for example, because they can be much more difficult to trace if anything happens. But aside from that, if you're doing it through a bank transfer, you've had it in your contract, the amount is confirmed in your contract, and you ask for a receipt, for example, then that should be enough. Sometimes the tenants needs to pay for the damages of the future facilities or property while the landlord is responsible to carry out repairs of the whole property. What's the balance between the two? When will the tenants be charged for these? So tenants will have to pay, yes, if you cause damage to the property, then obviously you will be responsible. So the idea is that you're supposed to keep the property in the condition that you found it in. So you keep it clean and tidy, and you don't damage anything in there. So if you do cause the damage, if, for example, if you spill something on a carpet, spill red wine on a carpet, that's damage that you will be responsible for. Or if you break something in the property, then that's something that you will be responsible for paying for or replacing. The landlord is responsible for carrying out repairs which are not your fault. Anything that you haven't damaged and falls within the landlord's responsibilities that we spoke about earlier, then the landlord has to do that. The types of things that the tenant is not going to be responsible for paying for are things like anything that happens as a result of general fair wear and tear. So just from using the property in a normal way, things are going to happen. So you have general scuffs maybe on the walls, or you might have just scratches around here and there. Those things are expected to happen as a result of you using the property. So you shouldn't be liable for paying for those things. But anything that's obvious damage that the tenant has caused, then they will be responsible for. So the next question is how many weeks of rent are deposits usually equivalent to? So your deposit will normally be your security deposit is normally be required to pay 5 weeks worth of rent if you're paying under £50,000 a year, I believe. Otherwise, you'd have to pay 6 weeks worth of rent. So that's different from a holding deposit. A holding deposit, you'd be required to pay 1 week's worth of rent. So just bear that in mind. And then the final question, just going back to Louise, if the quality is unacceptable, if there's a water issue and the quality is unacceptable. Right, I think I'm going to communicate with you on this separately, Louise. I'm just going to send you a private message because I'm really sorry, I still don't understand what you mean. So I'm going to send you a private message just so we can chat about it a bit more. There's no other questions, so I'm going to assume that nobody else has any questions, and I'm going to respond to Louise. If you do have any last minute questions, please feel free to ask them. I am going to keep this open. So if you think of anything, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to type a response just to Louise. If you have no questions, then please do feel free to leave the webinar. And thank you very much for attending. I hope you find it useful. And don't forget to attend the rest of the webinars in Housing Week. So we will have a number of other webinars coming up this week. We have our major housing fair coming up tomorrow. So if you are still looking for accommodation, please drop into our housing fair. You can go onto our website on the events page and register to attend. It will be at 11 o'clock tomorrow. So do feel free to go onto our website and have a look at that. We also do have a number of other webinars coming up tomorrow and sorry, not tomorrow, Friday. So do take a look and register for that as well. Thanks very much for attending. Hope you have a good remainder of your day.